Okay, so a few more of you joined, so we'll start the session now. So hi everyone, welcome to this webinar looking at tenants' options when it comes to dealing with non-negotiable landlords. I'm your host, Suzanne Byrne. I'm a freelance journalist for the likes of The Guardian, the BBC. I'm also a media consultant and media coach. So I'm just going to talk through some of the kind of practicalities of the webinar first. It's going to be about 45 minutes in total. We're going to have a 30-minute panel discussion, and then that will be followed by a Q&A session. Some of you have already sent in your questions, so thank you very much for that. But we'll also be allowing for plenty of questions at the end. There is, you should see on your screen, a Q&A button. It's in like the middle of the screen or so. You should be able to see it, hopefully. So if you've got any questions, feel free to add them there and I'll go through them at the end. If you do have any other kind of comments or queries you'd like to make, there is a live chat tool as well, and that should be kind of on the right-hand side of your screen too. And some good news, the webinar is recorded, so if you need to perhaps dash off or you want to recall some of the kind of great advice that was given, it will be sent to your inbox afterwards, so look out for that in your emails. So on to the webinar itself. So we do know this has been one of the toughest, if not the toughest times ever for businesses right now. COVID-19 has affected all businesses pretty much, not just in the UK, but around the globe as well. And some sectors, as we know, have been more affected than others, particularly the hospitality industry. Now, I know that the government has tried to alleviate some of the pain with some grants, etc., and forfeiting the lease for non-payment of rent, etc. Still, many businesses are struggling. We've also had the second lockdown, which is being more impactful on small businesses right now. So many tenants cannot afford, the terms of the existing leases, let alone the accrued rents that have been building up since March. However, we do have some help at hand. We've got 3 panelists, and I'll introduce them to you in a second. So these 3 experts can help advise you, a tenant in a commercial property, to negotiate with your landlord and look at how you can perhaps future-proof your business. So I'm going to introduce the panelists now. So firstly, we've got Anthony Lorenz. He's the founding partner of the Lorenz Consultancy. So Anthony's been advising tenants and landlords and commercial property managers for 54 years. So he's been through a few recessions. So we'll discuss that in a bit. And he works with both parties to try and find solutions to kind of navigate these challenges that we're going through. We're also joined by David Buchler. He's the founder of the leading independent corporate recovery and restructuring firm, Buchler Phillips. And he's got 35 years experience under his belt in corporate turnaround. And say hello to our final panelist. It's Alex Schlagman from SaveTheHighStreet.org, which is a coordinated industry-wide initiative helping local businesses nationwide. And that's a movement powered by thousands of shopkeepers, industry leaders, and high street supporters. So let's begin with a bit of a question from, I suppose, each of our panelists, really. So you're all working with businesses kind of across the board. What kind of struggles are you hearing from small businesses right now? Perhaps if we start with Anthony first.
Well, it's not just small, it's small and large businesses. It doesn't matter what size the business is. We've seen loads of companies go to the wall. The government brought in a moratorium in March of this year when they saw that the coronavirus was hitting these shores. And the moratorium was brought in essentially to get landlords, tenants, and landlords' bankers, who have been somewhat invisible for the last 7 or 8 months, to try and find solutions as to how tenants can pay rents when they haven't got any income. We started in March going to landlords saying that restaurants, bars, clubs, etc. are closed. The landlord's initial reaction, as with anybody who's a part of a contract, was that it's not our problem. Your tenant's got a lease, and if he doesn't pay the rent, I'm going to sue him, which the government actually stopped under the moratorium, that no landlord can actually send in the bailiffs, and no landlords can take proceedings, or they can initiate proceedings, but they can't take proceedings for collection of rent, and rent doesn't have to be paid till January. So the first 3 months was extremely uphill. with landlords saying, what are you doing coming on the phone? Why is it my problem? It's yours. The next 3 months was landlords starting talking about deferment of rent, which is just kicking the can down the road, because it's difficult enough for tenants to actually pay for all their other outgoings while they're closed and not gaining income. And when the moratorium gets lifted, if it does get lifted, it could get lifted in January, then virtually a year's rent is got to be paid with no income having come in. And the third situation is that landlords are now beginning to cooperate, even the largest landlords. Some of them actually volunteered rent-free periods to tenants when the virus first came in, such as the Grosvenor Estate and Argent. And now they're probably in negotiation with those tenants about how they can ensure survival. And if we don't keep these tripartite relationships together, I dread to think what we're going to be going back to, because office tenants, for example, are now saying that they're only going to have people in 3 days a week, and they'll have Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday shift A, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday shift B, and Wednesday, Thursday, Friday shift B, shift C. And if 30% of office tenants are not going to be in the office Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, or Friday, Thursday or Friday respectively, then the leisure industry has a capped turnover, because people won't be going for lunch, they won't be going for after work drinks in their numbers that we've been used to, and they certainly won't be going to pubs, bars and restaurants if they're 40% empty. And so we're certainly experiencing problems. Landlords are, when we watch the television, the first thing we watch is the coronavirus number, and the second one is going up to Liverpool and Manchester mainly have been on the news, expressing all these bars, clubs and restaurants having to close. And we're actually trying to save the relationships between parties. And we also act for landlords as well. So we've got tenants coming to us saying we can't pay the rent, and we're sympathetic to their cause.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you very much for that. And David, just quickly, what kind of struggles are you hearing from businesses at the moment?
It's been a nightmare. The whole arena of lockdown, the first 3 months into the summer, was a disaster. The government helped with some cash flow in a variety of ways, both directly and through intervention, with loans, grants, tax deferrals, rent holidays, furlough schemes, restrictions on winding up orders for companies affected by the coronavirus. These initiatives, announced while most of us have been working from home, and some of us still are, have given many businesses a bit of a breathing space. But what will things look like when day-to-day business starts to operate more normally? If we get a vaccine that actually works, it is at the moment a nightmare, because all that's happening is that everybody is storing up a huge amount of debt, and eventually that debt, whatever help the government gives today, eventually that debt will come back and bite everybody's bum when they least want it to. So very, very difficult time in the future. There are no easy answers, but at the same time, the right approach, and with a bit of help to these challenges, which hopefully we'll talk about on this call, will perhaps find some solutions.
Okay. And Alex, I suppose we've been talking about saving the high street for many years, what with the rise of online and retail parks, and now we've got the pandemic. So what kind of struggles are you hearing, or even more struggles, I suppose, that you're hearing from retailers?
Well, look, firstly, I'll echo what Anthony and David have already said here, that we are in the most transformational, challenging period in the history of the high street. There's no doubt about that. But, I think one of the things that we've been really focused on doing is trying to uncover what does it take to succeed through this period. We're on a new era of the high street. We're currently in lockdown in England. And actually, what does it take to not just survive, but even thrive through this period? And so we focused a lot around research initially. We studied, with 1,500 businesses, what was it taking for them to adapt and protect and even grow their business through this period. And we've been supporting at various different levels, hundreds of others up and down the UK to navigate through this period and be as successful as they can. Some of the key themes for local high street businesses in terms of ensuring they give themselves the best chance of succeeding through this period. One, which I think we're going to touch on quite extensively, is around cash flow. How can you reduce your costs and manage your costs? One of the big costs here, a big theme of today's discussion, is around rent. And so making sure you're really sort of proactively and effectively in negotiation with your landlord to find a sustainable solution around your lease agreement is obviously key, but there's a number of other costs in your business you need to be on top of here, both indirect and direct, from everything from utilities bills and payments charges. You've got to be very careful around team at the moment, and team is a big theme in its own right as well, because people costs, it's not about just costs, it's also about, you know, the emotions of yourself as a founding partner in your business, but also the other staff in your business. It's a very challenging time emotionally for people as well. So big theme we're dealing with around people generally and supporting businesses through that. One of the second big themes we're looking at is around how to sell in new ways. So there were certain trends that were already going on the high street. You mentioned online, but actually the high street has certain inbuilt advantages over online pure play retail. It's local, so local to local delivery, click and collect, reserve and collect, reservation systems have really boomed, and there's been a whole sort of raft of support we've been providing to make sure businesses can still sell through lockdown in new ways, whether it's curbside click and collect, whether it's local to local delivery as quick as a takeaway pizza from any type of retailer, and even providing digital in-home services remotely without people physically being in proximity to each other. So lots of really interesting new innovations going on for the high street around selling in new ways. Also about growing as well. So we're in a period here where there's lots of businesses who are struggling. Some businesses are going under. A lot of businesses are underinvesting now in their marketing. So as a high street business, you often have a chance now to get more cut through, whether that's clever with your shop window display, engaging your customers through email, doing social media campaigns. There's all kinds of clever lockdown specific marketing campaigns you can put in place to be successful through this period. And the last point I'll mention, really in the context of now, and something we were refining through the lockdown 1, and we're building a lot of support at the moment, or plans for support at the moment for lockdown 2, which is about the relaunch. So, you know, there will come a time where you will be able to open again in a relatively normal way, even if we have phased opening of high streets. Now, at that moment there, you have an opportunity to really hit with a bang. And, you know, a lot of businesses didn't take advantage of that moment where people were able to come out and wanted to spend time physically back in the high street again, making sure you meet all the hygiene and distancing requirements that are, in some cases, legal requirements today, and in a lot of cases are about not just about the spread of the disease. This is about people's comfort in walking into your business locally so that they don't feel they're at risk, but balancing that with not turning yourself into a hospital. How do you maintain this feeling of a great customer experience?
Alex, there'll be enough time later. Let's move on.
Okay, so we kind of looked at a bit about government intervention there, and also talk about how tenants are struggling. So maybe if we'd like move on to how, you know, and that's why a lot of people are listening, to how tenants should to kind of negotiate with their landlord. So when they're thinking of preparing for these discussions, what kind of information do they need to kind of bring to the table as part of the negotiation process? I think this might be a question for Anthony here.
Number one, transparency is key. All right. There is no point in entering a negotiation with a landlord, right, if you haven't got a problem. All right. Landlords are going to want to have complete transparency with regard to your management accounts, how you've been trading in March, April, May, June, August, July, September, etc., compared with 2019 and 2018. They will want to know your cash position with regard to affordability. And they'll also want to see that if they help you, they're not just giving you a rent-free period and then you're going to pull the plug on them later. Obviously, landlords are in a difficult position because they can't actually collect the rent if you refuse to give it. And most landlords are actually clamoring for cash. There are all sorts of deals which can be done. For example, a landlord giving a 6 month rent-free period, but putting another year on the lease. Landlords looking for asset management opportunities. They might have a block date to develop the building. And as with one particular negotiation I'm handling today, the landlords have got a block date in 2026 to develop the whole building. Our client's lease expires in 2027. All right, and in consideration of bringing the lease back slightly by a year, which suits the landlords, they're prepared to cooperate. They also, if the lease is inside the Landlord and Tenant Act, have to pay statutory compensation when they refuse a new lease, so you can trade the compensation against the rent-free period. Landlords are often holding rent deposits and draw down on the rent deposit, but don't ask us to top it up again because we can't, all right, even though most leases say that they can top up the rent deposits. So there are all sorts of different ways in which landlords can get an asset management benefit out of it. But too many landlords think that they're going to, that their negotiations have to be on a break-even basis. That if they're giving something, they've got to receive something in return. And that's not the case, because the coronavirus is not discriminatory and just affecting tenants. It's affecting tenants, landlords, and bankers. And the market itself has already fallen. We might not have a market on which to judge that, but if you work on the fact that 30% of people are not going to come back to offices, there's going to be a 20% oversupply of offices, and grey space, which is plug and play space, is going to be unlettable in comparison with competition. With the current availability has gone up from 4% to 8%, but I anticipate that the availability of offices is going to be 20%. And clubs, bars, and restaurants haven't got the money to pay their landlords, so where are they going to find it from, all right, unless landlords cooperate?
Are you finding landlords be a bit more flexible than usual? I suppose they have to be?
Yes, we are, certainly. In the last month or two, they have become flexible, and they have to become flexible because they're stuck between the devil and the deep blue sea. Right, the devil is they've got to help their tenants, and the bankers should come in and help their landlords by giving them a higher loan to value, perhaps, which still means that the landlord's going to pay higher interest on his loan in any case. And the landlord should then help the tenant with the rent-free period, because if the tripartite relationships are destroyed and every landlord in Leicester Square refused to help every tenant, we'd have 30% of Leicester Square empty. And how the mayor is going to infuse tourism with Leicester Square 2/3 empty, I don't know.
So do you expect
it's
that...
a partnership, isn't it, Tony? There should be a partnership between landlords and tenants in order to get to the right place. And for those landlords that don't recognize that, it's going to be a much more difficult process in trying to find a deal.
That's exactly it. And I would add to that, David, and please butt in, because I do. I would add to that that the bankers need to work with their customers, which is the landlords, to say, look, we do not want you to default on your loan. Rents are going to go up, rents are going to go down, yields are going to go up. So where a banker is given a 70% loan to value, that is not safe anymore. If rents go down by 30%, take a restaurant at 100,000 a year at 4%, it's worth 2.4 million. If the rent goes down to 70,000 a year at a 5% yield, because property is more dangerous than we anticipated it was, because we could be attacked by these things, 70,000 a year at 5% is 1.3 million. So the property, the borrower's got 1.8 million pounds worth of borrowings and 1.3 million pounds worth of values. And then we're going to have a banking crash. And if we do not get to grips with what the government has asked us to do, which is use the moratorium to keep the relationships together, we are going to have liquidation signs all over London, all over the country, probably worse in Alex's territory in the high street. And the only way we're going to save the property market is by everybody listening to what the government is advising us to do, which is solve your problems you've got. Do not build up debt. Do not refuse to give any help to your tenants, because you will be the first at the end of a liquidation or at the end of a CVA, and that will be discussed later. But there are ways in which we can put negotiations on the tenants' foot when landlords don't cooperate, and this is part and parcel of this seminar.
So Alex, what are you hearing? So go ahead. Were you going to speak anyway? Yeah.
Yeah, no, just sort of building on what's been talked about here. I think the word partnership's absolutely key. You know, again, I'm echoing the sort of tripartite nature of this relationship here. The banks need to be at the table too. We need to find sustainable solutions that work for all parties for this to be sort of a long-term successful future that we all want this to be. I think the nature of partnership, I think one of the things that we're seeing here, which is an increasing openness from the landlord side, and you know, one of the things we've been working really hard on from a data analytics point of view is around what historically has always been called turnover rents. So the ability for a portion of how much you pay to the landlord to be tied to the amount of top line growth or top line revenue that you're generating. Now, you know, ultimately over time, not all businesses should just be measured purely on their turnover. You know, the contribution of value of that physical space should be a little bit more complex, sophisticated than that. But ultimately, this is about partnership. And if we talk about partnership, not just using the word, but actually put it into practice, one great way of doing this is to make sure the interests are all aligned, that we all share in the risk and reward of being on the high street together. And that is landlords, tenants, and banks.
Yeah, no, it's interesting you brought that up, because there has been a lot of larger retailers move towards that model, hasn't there? I think there's been New Look and All Saints being reported in the press in the past few weeks. How feasible is that, Anthony and David? Is that a possibility that could be, you know, seen across all businesses? Obviously, it might not work for the offices, but perhaps for retailers, is that a possibility? Could we see an actual shift in the way leases are kind of created and what they're based on in the future?
There's no doubt that without, especially in the hospitality business, which is very easy to do turnover rents, and also in the retail businesses, there's no doubt that if you can't trade, you can't pay. Right? And accordingly, the turnover rents is a very, very good idea. The Crown themselves are actually offering their tenants who are in trouble turnover rents, generally restaurants, bars, clubs at 9% of turnover. We've done various deals with landlords already, right, on turnover rents, on late night venues especially, who have been the most affected because they not only had the lockdowns, but also the 10 o'clock curfew. 10 o'clock curfew, social distancing. You can't run a discotheque with social distancing. It just doesn't work. So they've had to change their operations completely. Turnover rents are the future in the retail and hospitality industry. Unfortunately, the biggest problem that landlords and bankers have is that they're working from old numbers, right? They're working from 2019 values, which were going through the roof, and they're endeavoring to maintain them as anybody would try and maintain. But if the market is crashed, and if you buy a house for £1 million and the market goes down by 30%, you're going to be the last to sell if you carry on quoting £1 million for a £700,000 house. And the answer is that the landlords who accept that the market has gone from whence it was, right? The landlords who accept it will do deals with their tenants and they will keep them there. And the landlords who use bully boy tactics and say, you've got a contract, and if you don't pay me, I'm going to sue you, they will be suing into a vacuum. And they will be the people who won't be letting their properties, and they will have the liquidation boards on them.
And it's quite scary if they threaten to sue them. What kind of legality, what kind of legal ground would tenants have then if they said they did threaten to sue them?
Well, the government at the moment has, given tenants at least breathing space up to next March. They have, I think it'll be certainly to the end of March, if not beyond. They'll give them breathing space to try and keep the business going and whatever. And the whole purpose behind the government strategy is to say, we want to keep the businesses going. So they've changed some of the insolvency laws. They've added a new feature to the insolvency laws to try and help businesses keep going. They want to keep businesses going as much as possible. But for goodness sake, I mean, you just have to walk around the city and the West End to realise that you can't keep businesses going if nobody's coming into London or into the city or into Manchester or wherever, and you know, going to work there and working there from offices or wherever. And at the moment, nobody's really coming in, so that makes it a disaster. It's a fulfilling prophecy that doesn't do anyone any good.
So just going back to that kind of landlord and tenant negotiation, should they be bringing to the table just saying, look, these are kind of 5 things I'd like, or, you know, these kind of some points to bring to the table when they are in discussions with them? Are these discussions happening, I suppose, are people asking, oh, should I have one over Zoom? Is it through email or doing phone calls?
We're having 6 or 7 con calls a day on Zoom and similar. All landlords are engaging with us because we are there to engage with them. We've also got landlord situations where tenants are coming to us and we're acting for the landlords and we're having to engage. And our advice to landlords is get the money in your pocket if you can, right? If a tenant is prepared to pay you 2 months rent out of 3, and you can bank it with the risk that that tenant is going to fail, you'll be a hell of a lot better off, number one, helping your tenant cover the problems. And obviously we have to see cash flows, accounts, etc. But number 2, God forbid they do go into liquidation or they do carry out a CVA or some other process, which we ought to discuss fairly shortly, then you're going to be worse off if you don't do a deal with your tenant, because if you just let the debt grow in the hope that you're going to get paid and you don't get paid, you'll get nil instead of something and you'll have an empty property.
Okay. So what should tenants do if landlords aren't budging an inch and won't entertain a conversation about a change to their lease, even in the short term? What's your kind of advice there?
In very short terms, and I can answer it in one sentence, they should come to us and David Buchler so that we can show them what to do, which we're going to discuss shortly, because there is no doubt that our most powerful weapon with regard to a non-cooperative landlord, and that's the heading of this seminar, right, is that tenants who are able to satisfy the criteria in order to propose a company voluntary arrangement are in a position to tear up their lease, effectively name their own terms going forward, get rid of their debt to the landlord, and maintain their business in its existing format without very much embarrassment, because it's not a liquidation, it's not an administration, it's a voluntary arrangement to make a proposal which says, I am having difficulty and I need to use this law which was brought in by Kenneth Cork in 1984 in order to avoid liquidations, to maintain my tripartite relationship and have a crack at my business surviving in the new market that we're going into.
Brilliant. Well, this is actually David's area, isn't it, David? So can you just explain what a CVA is and the whole process? You know, there's going to be people sat here who have never heard of this. So how does this come about? How do they go through this process?
Thanks, Susie. Look, Tony is absolutely right. At the end of the day, it's all about trying to save the business. And there are too many businesses that have at the moment severe financial problems. They don't know quite where to turn or what to do, and they can use the legislation that exists today to try and cut down the debt, reorganize the business that they've got, and ensure that they have a new deal with the landlord, their landlord, that makes sense for their business moving forward. I start off by saying that any possibility of doing a deal with the landlord should be number one. If they can do a deal and the landlord's a willing partner and Tony's able to negotiate something, do it. But if you can't do it and you've got a landlord that's just stubborn and looking at the past, then a CVA, a creditor's voluntary arrangement, is effectively just a reorganization of the debt and a reorganization of the company. And within a CVA document, you can set your reasonable terms with your landlord as to how the lease should move on. As Alex has said, a lot of the new deals are based on turnover, and that really does make sense. And there are good grounds that Tony has mentioned about agreeing deals, you know, whether it's 8%, 9%, whatever it is. There are good grounds for agreeing deals on a turnover.
Can I just come in here for a moment and give you the reality of exactly how we work? A tenant comes to us, he's got problems, right? We go to the landlord and say he's got problems. The landlords want to see a chapter and verse on all the financials, etc. If the company has got cash flow problems, they can probably qualify for a CVA. In order to qualify for a CVA, you need 75% of those that vote. And David's going to correct me on this, he always does, which could include 50% of, up to 50% of connected creditors.
Non-connected.
Pardon?
Non-connected.
Non-connected, up to 50% of non-connected creditors to vote, all right? And in the event of you getting the CVA through, the lease is torn up, right? You follow the terms of the lease in terms of term, etc. You can propose a market rental value. The landlord is bound to accept it. He can't not accept it, with the exception of going to court and challenging that the proposal is unreasonable. So the boot's on the tenant's foot. And what we do is we get the mathematics of the we take the tenant client to David's firm. They go through all their financials. We get the mathematics that they can qualify for CVA. And once we can qualify, we don't need to push the button. We then go back to the landlord and say, look, this negotiation is not the way it was. It's not a contract which you can enforce. We are going to be able to satisfy the mathematics of a CVA. We are going to write our own lease, which might be on a turnover rent. It might be on 50% of the rent that the tenant's paying. Whatever is affordable in the new market is the right market rent. And if you don't actually do a deal with us, we'll give you 14 days to do a deal. Otherwise, we're going to have to push the CVA button. And the date of the CVA is the date when the rent which is owed to the landlord stops. So, for example, if you do a CVA on November the 10th and you owe September quarter day's rent, then you only owe from September quarter day to November. If you're up to date with the landlords with regard to paying rent, then because each vote is worth £1, if you owe him nil, his vote is worth nil, and therefore you've only got to have another debtor of £2,000 effectively for the CVA to go through. And the CVA is the ultimate tool which puts pressure on tenants, landlords, and bankers to actually find a solution towards keeping their relationship together. And even though the landlord complains of hardship under a CVA, that's the law. The law which was brought in by Kenneth Court for company voluntary arrangements was something that a landlord faced if his tenant got into difficulty when he first granted the lease. And therefore the tenants are in difficulty, and the landlords shouldn't complain that we're using trickster methodology in rearranging our relationship with them. The law entitles the tenant to rearrange the arrangement, and the law entitles the tenant, subject to him getting the qualifying votes to actually get a CVA, to write his own terms, which are reasonable commercial terms under the in connection with the premises which he holds. And I'd like to ask David to add just a little bit to that because it's so important.
Yes, David, actually, I was just going to ask about the costs associated with CVAs and how long the process generally is.
Well, there's not a lot I can add to Tony's comments. He knows his stuff. He knows what he's doing. He knows what he said. The costs are not.
I've learned more from you, David.
Well, you know, you're a good listener. The costs are not that material. A number of thousands of pounds. It's not a huge amount, but it can be the difference between saving your business and not saving the business.
Okay.
And on the cost side, because I think listeners should know, the majority of work we've done are £7,500 to £10,000 for the full document. But we actually stop at a halfway stage where once the CVA numbers are known and we can actually carry out the CVA where the landlord knows we're going to write our own terms if he doesn't do a deal, that's the time when landlords are really talking about rent-free periods and giving their tenants help. Because if they think their tenant's going to survive, they still hope that they can build up these arrears and eventually get some money. But if they know that the tenant's going to push the button if they don't do a deal, the boot's on the tenant's foot to write their own terms on the lease going forward.
Okay, so we've got a lot of the pros there of CVAs. Are there any kind of downsides to going through that process?
The ones which have come up, and I'll give David some of it, the ones which have come up from tenants is, I don't want to be seen to be liquidating the company, but they're not. They're using what's called a company voluntary arrangement. There's the downside that the landlord can challenge it in court, but if your proposal is reasonable, right, then the rent's going to go down. It's down to what we might say 9% of turnover, and the landlord's challenge in court might be 12% of turnover, or we might say 100,000 a year, and the landlord's challenge in court might be 120,000 a year. So there's no reputational side because Pizza Express, Travelodge, Ask Restaurants have all done CVAs. And when landlords are actually demanding rent when the moratorium comes off, everybody's going to be doing CVAs. So we're just ahead of the game.
It's going to be a trend, unfortunately. So other than CVAs, are there any other options available to businesses?
Well, the CVA is one which enables businesses to survive. And this is all about survival. But if you can't survive, then you have to liquidate.
The CVA, let's make it clear, because I don't like leaving various options. The CVA is, right, the defence strategy against a landlord who is pushing too hard and is not listening to their tenant, is not being accommodating. And these are not times of aggravated negotiation. These are times of conciliation. And in order,
Alex, are you seeing that on the high street?
Yeah, no, pretty much what Tony was just saying there, I think, is really important. People don't want to do a CVA, let alone go into liquidation. This is not what people want to do. Particularly get away from the big nationals who potentially have too much store footprint anyway and have done for quite a long time because of the structural changes going on around retail and maybe, you know, the excessive aggressive expansion of some of the private equity-backed restaurant groups. You know, the majority of smaller chains and smaller businesses do not want to go back down this route. And the reason this is being looked at primarily is to give some extra leverage in the negotiation so that they can get to what they believe to be a fair and equitable deal with their landlord. That's the perspective from the majority of the high street. There's a nuclear button that may get switched on, but they don't want to push it. Nobody wants to push this. Everyone wants to carry on terms that they've already got. There might be one or two places that they would be happy to lose if needs be. But largely, this is about getting to the terms on all of their assets that they think are sustainable for them.
And so a CVA could be used as a kind of tool to negotiate, really, if you kind of pose the threat of a CVA.
Yeah, it's what Tony does best. He takes you know, the documents that we'll prepare and he will then discuss those with the landlord, and with the landlord knowing that if they don't agree a deal, there's going to be a CVA that will enforce a deal. The landlords are much more able to negotiate something more sensibly.
Okay, so thank you for those discussions right now. So I'm going to just actually look to see if we have got any questions. So we do have one from Daniel Harris here. He is asking, am I correct in understanding that if the majority of debt is with the landlord, then the CVA route will not be possible? So maybe that's one for David.
I've just answered that to David, funnily enough, and thank you for the question. Number one, look whether the landlord has a rent deposit, because if he's holding a rent deposit, that is payment of that debt. So if you owe 9 months rent and you've got a 6-month rent deposit, you only owe 3 months rent. You've got to get the landlord's vote to be less than 25% in order to get your 75% majority voting in favour if the landlord votes against. So two things. Number one, have you got a rent deposit? And then ask the landlord to take the rent deposit down, to draw for the rent deposit. And in fact, even if he doesn't, it's assumed as being paid, is it not, David?
Yeah.
Right. And the second point is, if the numbers are quite close and you've got to pay the landlord an extra £20,000 to get him under the 25%, then pay him the £20,000 and then CVA it, and then you've got your business intact.
Fantastic. And if anyone listening has got any questions, feel free to put them through in the Q&A button. I can see a couple more coming through. We've got one that has come through privately. So someone said, how would you approach a landlord who refuses to give you concessions, but does give it to other tenants, especially when you're not allowed to discuss? So thank you for that. That's a really, really good question.
I saw that well, and I was trying to answer it. Number one, speak to your neighbours. All right, even though they're meant to be under confidentiality clauses, they will actually tell you. They won't tell you, but there'll be an intimation as to what's happened. And number two, all right, really, you should have an agent speaking to your landlord with regard. They're professionals in speaking to landlords, and therefore they will then go to all the other tenants and find out what's happened. Somebody else asked a question, John Lovell, what is the difference between being a covenant strong tenant and a covenant weak tenant? There isn't a difference with regard to CVAs. You can be very covenant strong. You can have a business which made millions of pounds previously, but he can't see his way forward under the terms of the existing lease, and he's going to start losing that money in his bank. He can equally carry out a CVA, and so covenant landlords take the attitude that if they're big companies, they don't want to help them. We've got a massive negotiation in Mayfair with one of the estates at the moment, who don't seem to understand that the fact that the tenant used to make 2 or 3 million a year leaves him in a position whereby if he's paying £1 million a year going forward for his retail unit, he's not going to be able to have a business, and so he can do a CVA. So I think that that next door neighbours, information is key. And information of your own position is key, that you really do need to show the landlord that you need help. And you certainly need to show David Buchler you need help in order to get the CVA through. And once you've got the ability to carry out a CVA, the whole negotiation structure between landlord and tenant actually changes, to the extent that I did offer one particular landlord a settlement. And now that we can do a CVA on that property, that's closed. All right, and he's come back to me saying, yes, I will accept what you offered. And I said, well, that was then and now is now. Now, instead of getting 135,000 a year, you're going to get 9% of turnover, which is going to be about 55,000 a year.
Okay, so we've got another question. This is a question for David. As an IP, can landlords make a claim for future rent for voting purposes in the CVA?
Yeah, landlords are not prejudiced by whatever claims might be made in due course. But for voting purposes, the chairman of the meeting will probably value future potential future debt at £1 for voting purposes.
Okay, fantastic. And we've got some other questions coming through. So Christopher Green has asked, can the landlord turn down the 20,000 that Tony just mentioned?
Firstly, commercially speaking, landlords are so desperate to get money in the bank that whatever you offer them in rent, they're going to accept it. It takes a very, very strange landlord, Christopher, to actually turn it down. Secondly, if you're not allowed to unfairly prejudice a landlord, and I'd like David to answer that one. So a tenant owes a landlord £50,000.
Yes.
And he needs
the answer is yes, they can turn it down if they want to, but you're only then going to have to, the landlord then is going to have to face a potential reduction in rent anyway through a CVA or a different sort of deal. But the landlord's entitled to turn down whatever they've got.
Okay, we've got another question here. What is the best way of calculating a fair rent in the current market?
There isn't a current market. That's a very good question, and it's actually one where I'm either bold or LBW or caught or stumped, right? The truthful answer, we don't know what the current market is because there isn't a market. Right?
Alex, sorry, go ahead. Yeah.
But certainly on the bar, club and leisure market, I can see reduction. The most important thing on offices is Lehman's. And in Lehman's crashed on September the 15th, 2008. And I did 3 rent reviews in a building called Queensbury House, Old Burlington Street, June, September and December, either side of the Lehman's crash. June was £102 a square foot, September was £78 a square foot, and December was £68 a square foot. So Lehman's, which was only a banking crisis, not a change of heart with regard to how every single person in this country and in the world feels about business in the future. And Lehman's crashed by 32%. I do believe that the leisure market is going to crash by at least 30%, if not more, as a fair rent. And if you don't want to put a fair rent in the CVA, I mean, I would stand up in court on every central London.
Are you saying the leisure market, Tony, or the commercial market?
The leisure market at least 30%, and it may even be 50, right?
And the commercial market?
I think 20 to 30%. I know that Cushman and Wakefield put out one of these estimations today that the market hasn't dropped at all for September quarter day. And I was on the phone to one of the magazines today saying, I've never seen anything like it. I mean, they must be blind, deaf and dumb as far as I'm concerned.
Okay.
I'd like to let a few buildings to their clients, let's put it that way.
We've got a couple more questions, so I'll just go through these quickly. Someone's saying anonymously, I run a small cafe and have been unable to pay rent to my landlord since March. My landlord is constantly phoning me and has been quite threatening. He said that if I do not pay in 2 weeks, he'll evict me and sue me for all the money I owe. But that's against the law, isn't it? So
the law as it currently stands doesn't give the landlord that power. And your cafe owner should be fined, but eventually come Easter next year, there could then be a reckoning, and so better for your cafe owner to take some help at this stage. And by the way, just to tell you, at Buchler Phillips, we are giving it that help initially free. We are prepared to try and help people free of charge to, in all of the initial conversations to work on these sorts of things. And we'll work with Tony and Alex, the same with you if you have any issues that you know about. We want to try and save the companies from going through all of the difficulties that exist at the moment.
Okay. And one more question from Oliver Butler. How does the CVA process work on negotiating lease renewals where a landlord is demanding an unreasonable rent?
The lease renewal would be probably protected by the Landlord and Tenant Act. The tenant has the ability to go to court to prove a fair rent at the end of the day, which would take a year to a year and a half in the central London market at the moment. So he can hold over the existing rent. You can even carry out a CVA. I think we found this out recently with the tenant who is holding over can carry out a CVA. So he's got the CVA ability to him, whereby the rent will be the market rent, which the court would award at the end of the day if you went to court. All right. So unreasonableness doesn't come into the picture.
Okay, fantastic. I don't think we've got any more questions left there. I'll just ask one as we kind of wrap it up. How do we take the kind of lessons learned from COVID-19 to kind of shape the future of rents and leases going forward? Maybe one for you, Alex, here.
Yeah, so I think that there's a lot of change that was already happening prior to COVID-19, and what COVID's doing is accelerating some of the big things that we knew needed to happen in this market. I'll just share a few of the headlines from my point of view. You know, the days of, long, talking 5-10 year upward only leases, they're gone on the high streets. It's going to be much more flexible structures between landlord and tenant. And it's in everybody's interest, actually. We need to build a sustainable future high street. It needs to be much more dynamic. It needs to meet the needs of the local catchment around that area. So actually plan that high street better across use classes as well. A lot of high streets, a big part of saving the high street is shrinking parts of the high street. Some high streets are too big, there's too much retail. We need to have different other uses, other commercial uses and residential in town centres to be successful. And actually within Class E, which is all types of high street uses, we need to be able to have the right mix of offerings to serve the needs of that community, or from a distance selling point of view, the gaps in the market that businesses can fulfill. So we need to have that dynamism and that flexibility. So we need to have a lot more flexibility in the planning system, and we're seeing changes already begin on that, and it will continue. I'm really sort of optimistic that we're going to see a much more flexible planning environment in the future, and we're going to need to see much more flexible lease arrangements between landlord and tenant. We touched on before the idea of aligning interests. So turnover rents for me is not the end, it's the beginning of a journey towards actually understanding the true attribution of value of a physical space to the business and sharing that value through the value chain. So actually understanding how can a business, a landlord, and in the case here, the theme for today is the banker, the lender, actually share the risk and reward of being on the high street together. And we're doing a lot of work in this area around the analytics around that, so that we can better understand the performance of a business today and forecast what that might look like in the future, so people can mitigate those risks and move into that future more confidently. I think the reality is we're moving into a world where, regardless of this conversation and the support that myself, David, Anthony can provide to the businesses listening in and beyond in this market, we are going to move into a space where the vacancies are going to increase in 2021. So what we need to be doing is finding a way to attract the next generation of high street businesses to the high streets, to our shopping centres, to fill the gaps that are being left and aren't being repurposed into other uses. And to do that, we have to build an environment which allows businesses to set up and succeed on the high street. So a big part of our mission is all around not just saving the existing businesses, but also helping businesses come onto the high street and be successful in this future. And to do that, some of these key principles I've just been talking about need to exist now and for the future. This isn't a long-term thing. We need to see this now.
Excellent. Okay, thanks, Sarah, Alex. We have got one more question that's come through, so hopefully we can just answer this very quick one. And someone anonymous has said, you've mentioned protection for tenants until Easter. Has the release from a forfeiture protection been extended? And I don't know who mentioned that. I don't know if that was...
I think David mentioned that.
I mentioned it.
Protection until March. There's actually only protection until January the 1st at the moment.
Okay.
I cannot believe that the government moratorium is not going to be extended, or if it does come off, the government won't give tenants a year to pay the back rent if they've survived as far as that. By that time, we do hope that during November and December, landlords, tenants, and bankers will really get together to try and make sure that as few companies as possible go to the wall, because the survival of neighbours is based on the survival of your other neighbour. All right, and if 20% of the high street is empty, then, or 30% or 40%, nobody's going to even go there anyway. I also would like to mention that landlords are looking at offices in a very, very different way, that they're paying for fit out and offering plug and play space. And often offices which have been fully fitted to a high standard are much easier to let than the traditional way in which landlords let premises, with raised floors and lowered ceilings, with the tenant doing his fit out. And the maths work very well. If the landlord does £100 fit out for a tenant, he's only got to get effectively £4 a square foot extra to let fully fitted premises, and the tenant would prefer to pay an extra £4 a square foot than pay £100 a square foot for his fit out. So the whole dynamic of the office market is changing as well. And actually, one more question has come through, so this will be the final question.
Susie, you're going to have to excuse me, I'm afraid. It's now 3:30 and I have to go.
Okay, well, David. Thank you very much for your time there, David. Much appreciated. So we'll just answer this one last question from Roger Cohen. Has anyone used the, is it RICS, RICS evaluation scheme to get a fair deal? Alex or Anthony, would you? The RICS valuation schemes to get a fair deal, I think it's so far removed from what we're actually doing. All right, the RICS have continued to allow valuations to go through. There are not really, it's very difficult. I wouldn't want to be a valuer in today's market because we're actually dealing with a crystal ball which has got black paint all over it, right? And I for the first time in my 5-decade career, I cannot predict accurately what's going to happen in March next year. I know there's only one way the market's going, which is going downwards, but how far it dips right into the future is complete unknown. And I do pity valuers trying to put valuations on properties today. I think the best method of valuing where the market is to look at the major property companies in central London, let's say Derwent, Great Portland Estates and Shaftesbury, who are exposed to mixed use portfolios. They fell about 40% in April, and they had about a 15% recovery when we heard about the what's it called, the venom which we put into us. I've forgotten the word. All right, what is the word when we? Pardon? Injection? No. When we've got these injections, which hopefully will get rid of the virus or make us safer. The answer is valuing property in today's market is almost impossible, and following any RICS guidance is not really worth doing. I think the most important thing is that landlords, bankers and tenants talk to each other. Yeah, brilliant. Well, hopefully we've provided you with lots of advice there kind of going forward. So I'd just like to thank everyone on the panel. So thanks for Anthony, Alex and David, who's left us. If you do have any other questions, please contact the Anthony Lorenz Consultancy. And also, like I said at the start, you might have missed this, but the webinar is sent to your inbox afterwards. So it's there for you to kind of look into if you want to seek further advice. But and please send it on to any friends or colleagues or people you advise, etc. We'd be very happy to take any further calls if necessary. And I suspect that we will be organising another webinar quite shortly to go into more detail about CVAs. Excellent. Okay, thank you everyone for your time. Have a good rest of the day. Thanks. Bye. Thanks.